Josh and Frankie with a couple of dumb shits. Hello, Primates! You found Primus Tracks. Congratulations! There are other places to find Primus Tracks, of course. There's a Facebook group, appropriately called Primus Tracks. We are at Primus Tracks on Instagram and Threads. PrimusTracksPod@gmail.com is the email address, and you can ask Tim Soya a question at 337-514-7692. He drinks American Coca-Cola just as often as he can. It's Frankie Berestein.
Hello, Josh.
I just snort amphetamines. I'm Josh. We are here today to talk to you about the fourth track from the Oysterhead record, the Grand Pecking Order, and that is titled Shadow of a Man, or, as I wrote in my notebook, Sombra de Hombre, which is fun to say. Frankie, thank you for the Spanish language version of things. The subject matter is dark.
Dark AF.
By the way, this will probably not be the most uplifting episode of Primus Tracks you ever heard, so if you have, we'll do our best to keep it informative and try not to wallow in the misery of the subject matter.
I don't know about you, but this is the first Oysterhead track that made an impression on me because the live performance that is included on 5 Gallons of Diesel. And I was so surprised, not only by the lyrics, but also by the performance itself. You know, Les wearing the helmet with the lights, the way that Stuart Copeland performs standing up. I mean, and the Matterhorn, of course, which we'll go into in a short while. But all of those things combined that were just so compelling that even if I wasn't into the record yet at the time that I discovered Primus, this song did find its way onto my audio library because it was just so compelling.
Probably the most theatrical track on the record, and you pointed to all the visual elements from the live performance. I just viewed that very performance earlier today. Great performance that made it to that 5 Gallons of Diesel DVD. This one, Frankie, Shadow of a Man, 3 minutes, 44 seconds, music and lyrics credited to Les Claypool. We're going to talk about that and why it's important in a moment. But you've got history.
Shadow of a Man was not part of the New Orleans set back in 2000. So I'm guessing that it was put together much later in the studio, and it was premiered until October 21st, 2001 in Seattle at the Paramount. Performed throughout the entire 2001 tour and performed again during the resurrection dates of Oysterhead between 2020, 21, and 22. And interestingly enough, it has also been teased by Les throughout numerous projects such as Frog Brigade and Primus. So it's definitely a song that finds its way into his mind frequently.
Tell me about those teases. Are they instrumental, or does he dive into those lyrics?
He actually sings a bit of the verse over whatever they are jamming.
A partial shadow.
Yeah, it's just a vocal tease, maybe with a little bit of ambience. But yeah, no, it doesn't go further than that.
Something you said earlier struck a chord with me in that this song really resonated with you, especially from that 5 Gallons of Diesel DVD. And I think the reason it resonates with me being this is familiar territory. We have the benefit of 20-odd years of hindsight. And with that, we can make the judgment that this is a pure Les Claypool song. It would fit, I would argue, on many of his solo works. You know, you could slot it in on Purple Onion, probably not bat an eye. Same with Of Whales and Woe.
Yeah, it's actually quite flexible now that you mention it. It does fit with whatever project you mention. I mean, if it were like perhaps a bit heavier, it could even be a Primus track, right?
I mentioned it a couple episodes ago that we're only 2 years removed from Antipop. And it does have a similar vibe to it as far as that tripped out ambiance, because we got doses of that with Liquid Sky, Sacred Cow, and a couple other tracks I'm probably missing. Eclectic Electric, of course. There are some similarities there, and I think there's some carryover. So, was Shadow of a Man an idea that Les had going into Antipop, and it was set aside? Was it an idea he already had written down after the fact that he brought to Oysterhead? Was it spontaneous while recording with these guys?
Mm-hmm.
We don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But it certainly feels like it has its roots in the Antipop cycle and then made its way to Oysterhead, to me.
And there's something that I must point out about Shadow of a Man, because I think it might be a very important factor in regards to why I enjoy the song so much.
Okay.
It might be the overall atmosphere of the track, of course, combined with the vocal delivery, which is very, very peculiar and idiosyncratic. But to me, Shadow of a Man is perhaps the most, I mean, of course, other than the covers, in terms of original material, it could be the most resident thing Les has done in his career.
I would buy that from an atmospheric point of view. It's certainly not wacky, but not everything the Residents does is wacky.
The vocal delivery is very Residents-like for me.
Yeah, I could see that connection. And now the Residents isn't something I was thinking of when I was listening to this tune, but I think I can see where you're coming from there because of what amounts to a fairly sparse musical delivery, more theatrical percussion as opposed to a drum kit, and it definitely goes places, and it's eerie. And much of the Residents' music would qualify as eerie. So I think I can see the parallels you're drawing there. At the same time, that I think feeds into the point I'm going for, is that this is familiar territory. This is a Les Claypool song. 20-odd years later, you can tell it's a Les Claypool song. And really, even at the time, it was the first post-Primus tune that we heard Les write on his own, I think.
Yeah.
At that point. And it's unmistakably his, even in 2001. Especially if you contrast it with the first three tracks, which sound like three guys working together to achieve a sound, as we've discussed in those three tracks. This is more pure Les Claypool. And I would argue that this is the best entry point to Oysterhead for a Primus fan who either hasn't tried Oysterhead or has no idea what they're getting into. Start here. You'll feel like you're on familiar ground. And a Fish fan might start with Raid on Balloon for the exact same reason. That's all Anastasio. Frankie, I don't know how often you do this, but I do it every summer. I find a very cold creek or river to go cool down, and you have to wade in up to your knees first because it may be 95 degrees or higher in the air, but the water temperature is about 42 degrees. You have to slowly work your way in. To me, as a Primus fan, Shadow of a Man was like wading up to my knees into that cold water, and then the rest of the tracks are dunking myself or diving in to get the rest of my body soaking wet and freezing cold.
Interesting.
But guess what? After a couple of minutes under that cold, cold water, your body acclimates to it, and you cool down, and you're refreshed, and you're having a good time. Hopefully that's the same experience Primus fans had when they made their way into the Oysterhead record. Here's the other thing we should be charting, Frankie. Musically and lyrically, 4 tracks in, we've gone on quite a journey. We have gone from the dreamy Little Faces to the whimsical Oz is Ever Floating to the struttin' Mr. Oysterhead, and now we get dark. Super dark. As you say, dark AF.
AF.
AF dark, dark AF. But lyrical darkness is prime Les Claypool territory.
Yes.
Need we list all the tracks that have dark lyrical themes? No! We'll be here all night. I think this is an appropriate tune, and I think, like I said, I think it's a great entry point for a Les Claypool or Primus fan first getting into Oysterhead. And I would assume there's 6 or 7 of you out there. And if you're listening, welcome aboard.
The great thing about the way that Les writes songs is that when he goes back to a topic or a particular theme, it doesn't seem repetitive. It's actually interesting how he expands on the idea to create 2 completely different tracks. The parallels that come to mind are, for example, Over the Electric Grapevine and Green Ranger. And here we have yet another war song. There are quite a bit of war-related tracks in Les Claypool's catalog. We have Too Many Puppies, Sergeant Baker, and this one definitely stems from that same idea, right? But those deal with kind of the immediate aspect of the war as it's unfolding. And Shadow of a Man is really interesting because it deals with the aftermath. And I think it's even more disturbing than those other tracks. Sergeant Baker and Too Many Puppies are not disturbing themselves. They deal with a very complex topic, but the way that they are delivered and the way that they are performed doesn't strike you as something terrifying. Whereas Shadow of a Man is incredibly eerie. It's quite disturbing. I mean, even the vocal delivery that could push the boundaries of what could be considered cartoonish is still eerie enough to actually make the lyrics kind of frightening, right? Mm-hmm. That's my impression about it. The aftermath is much darker than the actual event.
Let's not forget Bob the Unemployed Veteran from American Life. So this is, we're treading similar ground. However, we're looking at it from a different light or through a different lens, whatever metaphor you want to use. But you're right, we're dealing with aftermath. Much like we did in that one verse in American Life, we're expanding upon that idea and looking at it from another angle. A very specific angle. I think you're right to note that, and I think it's important to note that. We're not necessarily treading brand new ground. It's fairly familiar, even lyrically and musically, but it's another new twist, on the formula.
And again, Les is employing some very interesting songwriter strategies. Billy came back from Vietnam, just a shadow of a man, and then he just inverts the order. He was a shadow of a man when he came back from Vietnam. It's brilliant. Phrase, yep. It flows so well. It's so simple to just flip the verses, but it's quite compelling in the context of the song. It almost sounds like kind of a tongue twister or kind of a riddle, right?
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it. I hadn't, in all these years, thought about it that way, but it certainly could be interpreted that way. I think that repetition, too, is of the vocal delivery especially, but those lyrics, the repetition of that is effective because it just hammers home that point, and it inextricably links his experiences in Vietnam with being a shadow of a man, which, of course, is a loaded phrase and term unto itself.
Yes.
Do you want to talk lyrics first, or do you want to talk music first?
We can do the lyrics because we're already discussing them. So you can go ahead, and then I'll tell you my perspective.
Now, Frankie's the one that usually does an essay, but I think it's my turn to do one of a sort, because this is a topic. I mean, Vietnam. Where do you start?
Yeah.
The lyrics are very dark. They do match the subject matter. There's a lot we could discuss here as far as the Vietnam conflict goes. Childhood Les Claypool probably saw the Vietnam War on the news when he was a young man. Vietnam has often been called the first televised war. There was a lot of footage that made its way onto national news broadcasts in the United States and throughout the world, for that matter, showing the realities of war. And some of those broadcasts were pretty graphic, not even for the time. For any time. They would be considered graphic now. We got to see mostly American troops, but also some civilians, and much of the outcomes of what was happening there, and it was brutal. Of course, that's how war is, but it certainly shattered the glorious myth, I think, that had of this noble pursuit that we saw with, say, the First and Second World Wars, especially through the film industry that really glorified the Second World War. I just watched the movie White Christmas the other night, Frankie, while decorating my house. It did a decent job showing the reality of war for about 5 minutes. And then afterwards, all these soldiers and former soldiers were just happy-go-lucky and having great lives. And we know that's not necessarily the case. This being the first televised war really brought home the harsh realities of it and really helped turn public sentiment against what was going on over there, and eventually, I would say, contributed to American withdrawal from Vietnam. But it certainly didn't prevent the involvement of the United States to begin with. I'm not going to sit here and tell you everything about Vietnam because I don't know everything about that conflict. However, if you are a reader, I will recommend the book Sacred War by William Duiker, a noted historian and probably one of the foremost authorities on that time period in that place. I read this book, Sacred War, as an undergraduate, Frankie. Although it's written by an academic, there is some academic language in it. It's incredibly approachable. It's under 300 pages. It has photos. It has maps. He writes in such a clear, concise way that you will learn a whole hell of a lot about almost every aspect of this conflict in a short amount of time. Can't recommend this book enough. Oh, another one, Frankie, is Vietnam in HD. That's a television program, and it's actually pretty good. It was produced for the History Channel. Quite often, the History Channel is lousy for history, but this series actually wasn't that bad. It was pretty good for conveying some individuals' experiences that tie into many of the larger narratives of the war. If you can stream it, go find Vietnam in HD. It's worth your time if you're interested. So I will dispense with that grandiose commentary, and I want to stick to the lyrics that Les brings us. But as we know, Vietnam's still a charged topic for a lot of people.
It is part of popular culture, right? I mean, it has become a reference to any kind of awful situation, or, you know, when we talk about, I don't know if you have like the same expression in your language, but in Spanish, when we talk about a really, really dreadful situation or an ordeal that we survived, we refer to it as flashbacks of Vietnam. That's how ingrained it is in popular culture, I think.
It was so charged at the time that anybody that lived through it can probably tell you in vivid detail what it was like, depending on where they were. Even if they were home in the United States, they can tell you how charged everything was then, which is really interesting now, given the political situation in the United States right now in the 2020s, which is vomit-inducing. It was that intense 50 years ago, which seems hard to believe. Yeah.
Can I tell you a little bit of my perception so you tell me what you think?
Please.
So on the first verse, Les provides some context about what experiences left these psychological scars on the character. Now, he was spraying Agent Orange during the war. He came back from Vietnam. Now, in the second verse, it's where I think the development becomes quite compelling, because Les describes how this experience has had an impact on his wife directly. So 2 stillborn babies, and he blames himself because of his experience in Vietnam. So in order to escape from all of these memories and thoughts, he has taken to amphetamine and alcohol. It wouldn't be the first time that Les references the use of this drug, right?
Right. And it also wouldn't be the first time that you heard about a Vietnam veteran going in that path.
Exactly. The name change is quite interesting. Her true name was May Pan, but he liked to call her Diane. So I'll let you elaborate on that. I find it quite interesting. And lastly, when Les is just going on and on with Billy came back from Vietnam, but his voice, starts becoming less and less cartoonish, and it becomes more and more compelling. It reminds me a lot of the same effect that he used on The Carpenter and the Dainty Bride, where the main character is just repeating to herself the main refrain over and over. I think when Les does something like that, is because he knows that he has a very powerful phrase and he wants to drive it home. He wants the phrase to acquire as much power as possible. So in this particular track, perhaps it was not necessary to actually render the song with a conclusion as to the fate of the character. It's an open-ended track. The listener is free to use their imagination, but by just driving home this final verse, Les is kind of highlighting how this particular character cannot escape his past.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I get from the lyrics, which are incredibly well written, by the way.
So to start with the repetition at the end of Billy came back from Vietnam, just a shadow of a man. He was a shadow of a man when he came back from Vietnam. The vocal delivery becomes harder edged, and I think Les really starts to layer more and more vocals at the end of the studio take, if I recall correctly. That's something he's done before, and I've mentioned this before. To me, it feels like the Greek chorus in old Greek and Hellenistic plays, in which the Greek chorus would tell you how a character is feeling or tell you what's happening off stage. And to me, it's the Greek chorus telling us that everybody in Billy's life is saying this. And they're all saying the same thing. Vietnam changed him. He is nowhere near how he used to be.
Yeah.
And that is an unfortunate reality of what so many people who have fought in military conflicts have experienced. But I think it was amplified as far as Vietnam goes because of its nature as being the first televised war and being so unpopular domestically, and the treatment of soldiers who returned, which is another issue unto itself that Les doesn't necessarily address. But I do want to address some of the points you brought up, Frankie. I do want to start with the phrase shadow of a man or shadow of oneself. That phrase has massive implications, of course. When someone calls themselves a shadow of a man or a shadow of their former self, the form is there, which is akin to the shadow that you cast on the ground or on another surface from a light source. Your form is there. I don't know if you did this as a young person, Frankie, but I remember in second grade, they brought in a projector. They were able to cast our shadows in profile, and we were able to draw our silhouettes. And so I always think of that, my second grade silhouette, because it's me, but it's not me. It's a shadow of me. And obviously I've changed a little bit since second grade. I mean, the beard's about the same, but most everything else has changed about me since second grade. And so that's a shadow of myself as I am now. So the form is there, but it's in shadow. So the insides of it are vague, murky, dark. We've been using that a lot. Unknown, undefinable. When we're comparing it to the person or the personality before a life-changing or a traumatic event. So the former nature is obscured, and in this case, we would presume shell shock, the exposure to the Agent Orange. There is a link there, Frankie. Agent Orange and these ecological tools, weapons of mass destruction that the United States military forces used in Vietnam. Agent Orange, of course, that's one of the horrible narratives that comes out of this war. So Agent Orange was used to kill vegetation and clear potential hiding spots for the enemy, but United States soldiers were lied to as to its properties, Frankie. They were told, and there's propaganda out there about this that serves as evidence that the soldiers and the public were told that Agent Orange is harmless, that they could play around with it, splash it on their face and they'd be fine. That, of course, is not the case. It's poison. The military didn't seem to care what happened to their own soldiers who were exposed to it. They damn sure didn't care about what happened to Vietnamese civilians who were exposed to it, nor the environment that they were destroying for generations. So exposure to that causes many different kinds of illnesses. So Billy, our character in Shadow of a Man, by the way, that's a generic name Les will use again for another kid going off to war in Bucket of Bernie Brains. So there's a through line. So Billy is spraying Agent Orange, as is widely documented. Many of the soldiers who were exposed to Agent Orange developed illnesses such as leukemia, cancers, and many infants born to people who were exposed to Agent Orange were born with birth defects or born dead. And that, of course, that's the same with the Vietnamese people who were exposed, such as, we would presume, May Pan. May Pan and Billy exposed to Agent Orange, leading to those two stillborn babies. There's a through line there. And with May Pan, we have another theme of war brides, which is pretty common throughout recorded wars, that people who go off to fight in a foreign place, they're sharing traumatic experiences with each other, but they're also sharing it with the locals. And quite often, they end up marrying locals and bringing them home. And what's really fascinating to me is in the United States, of course, what quite often happened is the people that were brought home as war brides were anglicized. So Maypan becomes Diane, and she takes his last name. So Maypan becomes Diane Graham. If you want to extrapolate that more or less is the purpose of that would be to erase her culture and identity and to attempt to assimilate her into American life and culture.
Yes.
Of course, she's Diane Graham for the rhyme. Maypan, Diane, Maypan, Graham. But that also means that Billy is Billy Graham. And there's a very famous or infamous, depending on your opinion of the guy, Billy Graham, who was a televangelist for many, many years and made a whole shitload of money by going on TV on Sunday mornings and yelling at people about the Bible.
I got to think, once again, I got to thank Liz for teaching me English, because when I heard the song, I remember hearing Liz say she changed her name to Mrs. Graham. And then I looked up the lyrics, and that's how I learned that it's pronounced Graham and not Graham.
We have two people heavily exposed to Agent Orange having stillborn children, and that, of course, further spirals Billy's to the point of endless drug use, just to escape, right? Escape from the horrors of the war and the unstated things that happened to him, as well as these traumatic events of losing two newborns. This is another thing that comes through the lyrics that's implicit, and it's not necessarily indicated. Vietnam vets didn't get a lot of help when they got back, and even up to now, many of them still aren't getting help as they age. They're not getting the appropriate kind of help or amount of help or quality of help, and it certainly has shown over the last however many decades. Frankie, you a George Carlin fan? Let's lighten it up a little bit.
Not particularly. I'm not very familiar with his work.
I think Carlin is a good listen because, one, he's funny, but his later work is quite insightful. Often you wait a while for a punchline, but he is so whip-crack smart and such a good linguist. He, as I was reading these lyrics and thinking about Vietnam and all of these themes, I went back to a bit he has called Shell Shock. And he talks about how the term shell shock was coined around the First World War to describe a soldier who had just been frayed to the edges of sanity by their war experiences, was experiencing their life. And he said shell shock is about as accurate as it gets. And then he talks about how the term for it has been softened over the years to the point where we say post-traumatic stress disorder, which may be more accurate clinically, but it certainly kind of dehumanizes and takes the, for lack of a better term, shock out of the terminology and softens it a bit. So, but he ends with, if these Vietnam veterans had come back with shell shock as opposed to PTSD, which is now just another in a string of letters to identify a medical condition. If they had come back with shell shock, they probably would have gotten the treatment they needed. So he's great linguistic humor, great social commentary. Whew. So dark. So depressing, Frankie. Why did we do this to ourselves?
Totally.
And if you look at these lyrics, Frankie, 90% of them are, Billy came back from Vietnam just a shadow of a man. He was a shadow of a man when he came back from Vietnam. There's a couple of verses in there where Les says something different, but just from a handful of words, we can extrapolate and talk about so much because it's such a large, expansive topic, and a lot of people like to talk about things that are depressing and dark anyway.
In terms of the music, Josh,
mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're ready to proceed.
Oh, God, please. Yes. Get us out of here.
With music. All right. So if you watched, you watched the performance again quite recently. And I'm sure something that stood out for you was the very unusual guitar that Trey Anastasio was playing.
I'd never seen a guitar with antlers before, Frankie.
Totally weird, right?
What's up with that thing?
Okay. In July 2001, Trowbridge, also known as Cottrell, decided to build a hybrid semi-hollow body electric guitar based on an idea which materialized during the early 80s as a very weird-looking electric harp. Tro quickly realized that the instrument could only be played in a studio and had to be synthesized to compose anything remotely aesthetic. After 2 weeks of painstaking research, a set of final blueprints were completed. All the materials necessary and one tool, a Porter cable router, had been purchased so that production could commence. The goal was to have a finished product by August 4th. It was Tro's hope that his friend Trey Anastasio would take the Matterhorn for a spin, maybe sign it, or, best case scenario, buy it. Buy it. But with only a total of 4 tools and a time-constraining technical glitch that wasn't meant to be. The first bizarre guitar would not be ready until August the 10th. The Matterhorn was placed in Trey Anastasio's hands in mid-August. He was delighted. By October 10th, he had bought it, and shortly thereafter embarked on the fall Oysterhead tour. The sets included Pseudo-Suicide and Shadow of a Man, which featured Trey with his new axe, bassist extraordinaire Les Claypool, and drum virtuoso Stuart Copeland. So that's part of the blurb. November 21st, the Matterhorn appeared on national television, receiving a good thrashing as Oysterhead was featured on HBO's Reverb. Mm-hmm. Trey administered a blistering field test of the instrument, which clearly demonstrated the guitar's capabilities. This seems to be a really great start to the Trowbridge Guitar Company. So that's a little bit of background on the Matterhorn, this very, very unusual instrument.
I do remember some talk about it during the initial Oysterhead tour, once it was in his hands and was making the rounds. The people were saying, it's got this magnetic field, and so it's like a theremin, and people were saying, it's a total illusion or hack job, and I never got to the bottom of it, but you just helped us out, so I appreciate that. But it really does help create a theatrical element to these Oysterhead shows, because you have Les with all kinds of headgear and wearing the lights, masks and that sort of thing. Trey's playing a guitar with antlers. Stuart's jumping around between the guitar kit and his fun collection of cymbals and differing kind of drums. It looks quite esoteric in presentation, especially on that 5 gallons of diesel cut that we discussed earlier. So that's pretty cool. So we have the Matterhorn. He doesn't necessarily play the Matterhorn on this recording, correct?
I believe not.
No.
I'm just speculating, but it sounds like he could be sliding on the fret with one of those glass things that guitarists put on their fingers.
Yep.
Similar to what Lur used for Wynona's Big Brown Beaver.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, quite often just called a slide. Some people call it bottleneck style. But he certainly is using a slide on this track, without question. And that's one of that's one of the little highlights for me, because we have, and we're going to listen to the portions of the track, but we have a very staccato bass lick thanks to Les's echo effect that he's using. And I almost said Lur because there's a reason for that. Trey is smoothly sliding over it. So we have this contrast between staccato and legato of these two guys, and that's really neat to me. I like that a lot. Now, the reason I almost said Lur, Frankie, if you polled people who had only heard Primus and didn't know Oysterhead existed, and you played them, a portion of Shadow of a Man, what percentage do you think would identify this as a Primus song?
Well, my personal take is just a few.
Interesting. See, I go the other way. I think you'd probably get a majority of people saying this is Primus. That's Les, that's Larry, and that's one of 3 drummers. So because I really do think, to a degree, Trey is channeling Lur here, and I think it's partially a product of the tune that Les presented, as there's spaces to fill, but a pretty simple harmony to match up with, and he's doing some slide action that, to me, sounds pretty Lur-esque, actually. And I talked about it earlier that this tune is familiar territory. It's almost like Trey Anastasio is putting on those old Lur slippers and playing something musically familiar to me. But your take, I'm curious about that.
I don't know. I mean, the reason that I think the casual listener might not associate it with Primus is that it's quite atmospheric. And I believe the casual listener is familiar with the aggressive side of Primus.
Okay. So there are elements that could evoke the three men of power, and then there are elements that don't. But I just feel like people go, oh, yeah, that's Primus. And maybe that's just biased because they hear Les Claypool's voice and go, oh, that's got to be Primus. But to me, this is a very Primus-y sounding song. And I do think there is some kind of cosmic connection going back to the Antipop era. Let's hear some of this tune, Frankie. We've got, so let's hear the atmosphere inherent to this tune.
Billy came back from Vietnam, just a shadow of a man. He was a shadow of a man when he came back from Vietnam. Billy came back from Vietnam, just a shadow of a man. He was a shadow of a man when he came back from Vietnam. He was spraying that Agent Orange on the foliage of the land out of 80-gallon cans way back in Vietnam.
He is way up there, isn't he?
Yeah, I think it's Residence territory.
I think you might be onto something there. Maybe he's way up there in that nasal range. And then you probably heard the Sandman mic come through on the last line before the musical chorus. So he's, and that's, to me, that's also a very Residence thing, is that Sandman mic, that voicing. Maybe we do have a Residence vibe here, or some kind of inspiration from that part of his brain. Atmospheric, eerie. What I really like is and you'll hear it in that musical chorus, the big sound that Oysterhead and Stewart and mixer Toby Wright achieved with Stu's drums, as well as what Stu's doing, timing his accent hits on the cymbals. He's doing something somewhat syncopated, but every so often it matches up with some of Les's accents. So it's, they're mathematically linking up like common factors every so often. It's kind of cool. So we have established an atmosphere of eeriness and foreboding. And then we get our musical chorus. There's that slide. The mixing too, when you listen to it on headphones, you can hear the panning on some of those slides down too, which is pretty great. But the drums sound magnificently huge, and that's why I'm using the descriptor cinematic. And I think that's something that Stewart had been doing for a bunch of years prior to this effort anyway. So it was perfectly natural for him to go back to those unusual cymbals and drums and stand up and play those to accompany this tune. And I think it's appropriate. Can you imagine if he was just laying down a drum kit groove under this?
Interesting thought.
Wouldn't fit.
Besides, it's really fascinating what Stewart is doing with all of those cymbals. If we draw a Primus parallel, it kind of reminds you of how Tim Alexander would stand up to play the cymbals during the jam portion of Rapscallion, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So it's a completely different flavor. It's like in the absence of the kick drum and the toms, the drummer is filling space with other sounds and other things. And it just provides, a different flavor. And It's quite interesting.
To that end, it does sound larger and more all-encompassing and cinematic. And I think it really helps match the mood of the tune with the lyrics. Let's hear this cool part here at about 2 minutes, 20 seconds. So we're back. Okay, and that's something I wanted to highlight because Les goes back to the opening lick that he plays with the harmonics and the bend with that echo on it, so it's very staccato. Trey is harmonizing while sliding, so it's much more legato and smooth. Really cool part. Very brief. What works for you there?
That slight variation it's always pretty effective.
Should we listen to some of the repetition of Billy at the end? I want to hear that after kind of having that revelation as we talked about the lyrics and that vocal delivery. So let's hear everybody in Billy's life commenting. Bum ba bum ba bum bum ba bum ba bum 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 bum. Cool pattern. So a lot of voices there, less layers, a lot of vocal tracks there. That's why I think it's everybody in Billy's life making that same comment. Let's hear some Primates takes, Frankie. All you have to do to participate in this segment is go to patreon.com/Primus Tracks. Go check out all the options there. But the universal benefit is that I will post a thread, one hopes a week ahead of time, asking you for your takes on the track up for discussion, and I will read your thoughts right here. Eric in Australia. By the way, Eric in Australia, probably, I might be going out on a limb here, but I think he's probably the coolest librarian in all of Australia. Years ago, Frankie, we were exchanging book recommendations, and so, Eric, Sacred War, William Duiker. Hopefully you can find it. Eric in Australia says, Shadow of a Man, one of my favorites. I've studied the Vietnam War a lot over the years. It's great how Claypool uses his voice to highlight stories of people's life experience, like the veteran in American Life. We were thinking similarly. And Eric says this song has a sinister vibe, which I really enjoy. We haven't used the word sinister yet today, have we, Frankie?
Yeah, I believe at least once.
Many synonyms of it, at least. And your pal Frankie Brooks Delight says dark, eerie. He doesn't say dark AF. He says dark, eerie, and laced with amphetamine. These lyrics have Claypool written all over them. This could have easily been a Primus song. It's the only track on the record I feel that way about. I would love to hear how Primus would approach it. It'll most likely never happen, but I think it could be amazing. Brooks and I are on the same thought train there. We also have Jordan Kahn, who says, Les picks up from the end of American Life. Ha! There's another reference to that one. He says the 2001 version was a spectacle to behold with Les on the glow goggle helmet, Trey on Matterhorn, and the lights everywhere. He says the best was a chilly fall night across the epic Berkeley Greek Theater stage. It was one of the most astounding pieces of performance art I've ever witnessed. There you go, Jordan. Johnny Perona says, I love this song. Nobody paints a lyrical picture quite like Les, and this is one of his best. I feel like Stewart is completely in his element as well. It's almost like he is providing a percussive score to the war tale that Les is spinning. Trey is fine. Our pal Trish contributes some thoughts as well. This is interesting. She says, Shadow of a Man is a successor to Rooster by Alice in Chains, with Rooster being more of an F it, we're getting out of here anthem, and Shadow of a Man, a bleak glimpse of a veteran that no longer has the camaraderie of the shared hardships with his fellow soldiers. Trish is looking at it from a different lens. We don't necessarily hear about it in the lyrics, but we can certainly infer that this is the case for him. She goes on to say he's missing this sense of belonging he had with soldiers who knew what he dealt with because they were deep in the suck as well. And suffering from an amphetamine addiction that probably began with prescription medications, interesting inference, in the military to help deal with the effects of combat, and possibly continued as he got care from a VA. For never having served, Les is incredibly insightful and tells such a real story. Trish, thank you for those thoughts. So there's your Primates takes, Frankie. What do you think?
I agree with all of those comments. They nailed it.
Every single one.
Josh, do you feel that what Stewart is doing with the cymbals at the end of the track is like he's almost starting to take the track in a different direction, but then it just gets cut off abruptly? Like, we were only allowed a brief window of the life of this character through the song, but then it just ends abruptly and that window gets closed.
Are you talking about the fade out?
Yeah, the fade out. It's the way that the music, the turn that it takes, especially with what Stewart is doing with the cymbals. It's like it's starting to go in a different direction, right? But then it just cuts off.
Let's hear it. I see what you're saying. I think he's going back to the pattern that he established at the start of the tune, though. So he's making it cyclical, much like Les is with the bass lick that he's doing.
Yeah, it's an open-ended track.
Yeah, I mean, if you put it on repeat, much like any of the first 4 Primus records, it's going to feel like one big circle, I think.
I also wanted to point out, Josh, that during the recent performances, and I believe also during the 2006 performance at Bonnaroo, Les incorporated the Wamola during the prelude of the song, because Shadow of a Man has a prelude before it's performed live. First, they establish an atmosphere.
Yeah.
So you have Trey doing things with the Matterhorn, kind of showing off the instrument before the audience, kind of making, all kinds of noises come out of it. Les joins with the Wamola, and then when they have built enough atmosphere, Les will come back with a 4-string bass to begin playing the song. So you will see that performances of Shadow of a Man are quite lengthy, but in reality, it's kind of divided in 2 portions. You have the actual track, but you have all of these very extended prelude prior to it.
So that's why this track is over 12 minutes long. This live cut.
It doesn't mean that the actual song was stretched out. They pretty much perform it per the album version. The thing is that they do these very extended preludes.
Let's hear a portion of that extended prelude here. If you play that backwards, Satan's going to show up.
It does set quite an atmosphere, right?
It is spooky, got to give you that. Well, let's forward to the song itself as performed on Valentine's Day 2020. Once again, the tempo is nuts.
Billy came back from Vietnam, just a shadow of a man. He was a shadow of a man when he came back from Vietnam. Billy came back from Vietnam, just a shadow of a man. He was a shadow of a man when he came back from Vietnam. He was swinging that ancient horn on the voyage of the land out of 80 gallon cask way back in Vietnam.
I wonder if the up-tempo take there detracts from the eerie element. It does for me on first listen.
I hadn't thought about that. I think it just makes for a very cool alternative version.
Fair enough. We'll call it a draw. Let's hear the climax. Wow. 10 minutes and 15 seconds into Shadow of a Man, we finally get there. We've climbed the mountain.
Billy came back from Vietnam, just a shadow of a man. He was a shadow of a man when he came back from Vietnam. Billy came back from Vietnam, just a shadow of a man. He was a shadow of a man when he came back from Vietnam. Billy came back from Vietnam, just a shadow of a man. He was a shadow of a man when he came back from Vietnam. Billy came back from Vietnam, just a shadow of a man. He was a shadow of a man when he came back from Vietnam.
There's only so much you can do with 3 guys on stage, but I think they do acquit themselves nicely. It's nice to have Trey helping to layer those vocals.
I guess what makes the Hollywood performance so compelling is that not only do you have Les wearing that eerie helmet with the lights, but I might be misremembering, but that one is kind of closer to the album version in terms of tempo, right?
I think so. I don't think it's as fast, for sure. It might be...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one I think it's much eerier.
Yeah.
It's a different vibe on that one.
Yep, give me down-tempo Billy all day long. Well, I can tell you this, Frankie. Shadow of a Man, we shined the light on you, and you've been tracked. Next time, we're actually going to the other side. We have an all-Anastasio composed track.
Drifting is a simple thing to do.
Well, Frankie, I don't know what a radon balloon is, but I guess we're going to find out next week. Primates.
Can't wait for that one. Fun track.
Thank you all so much at Primus Tracks on Instagram and Threads, primustrackspod@gmail.com. Go take a walk, get some fresh air after this one. Oof, it was heavy. Later days.
Willie Mays.